Right.
There we go. We are recording. Excellent. And it looks like we have some people trickling into the waiting room.
Cool.
Bring everybody in. Yes, bring everybody in. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. We can see that you are here, but you may be very much muted and in the observer position. And that's just the way we like it, because I'm an introvert and I don't like looking at 20 faces. I don't even like looking at myself. I'm about to turn myself off.
I've got into that habit too. It's great.
It's great.
Like, I was talking to somebody recently and they were saying, like, where else in the world do you have a conversation with someone where you can see yourself while you're talking to them?
I know, it's weird, right?
Yeah, very weird.
So we'll people are trickling in, so this is going to keep going for a while. We're bringing everybody in all the time, and we'll probably get going in another 4 minutes or so if people want to grab refreshments. Do that. I think in general you should be able to interact with us by the emojis, so feel free to try that out. And then there's also a Q&A window, and I always have to find it by Braille. Oh, well done, Anita. So I think it's under the more options, the 3 stacked dots. No, why is it not here? This is the demonstration effect. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's under the 9 stacked dots on the bottom right. Meeting tools. And you should see at the bottom there's a Q&A, and so you can ask questions there. Can you see this? And what's nice about it is you can also upvote questions, but that's the Q&A box where we'll be collecting some questions that we get to in a bit. While people are trickling in. Right, welcome everybody if you're just joining. So this is a webinar for introverts where only Cameron and I can see each other. We can't see you, but you can interact with us by emoji and in the Q&A interface.
The worst kind of introverts that know each other.
Yeah, we could just sit here and be silent. That would be fun. Because we just communicate telepathically most of the time anyway.
So true.
Tell me how you've known each other for 10 years without telling me you have known each other.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we get going? I think people are going to keep trickling in, and this is really not about the numbers. Like, I don't care how many people show up, but I just wanted to have a conversation with you about governance for grown-ups, because when we talk, and we talk every week, multiple times, we tend to talk about our business that we have together and not about the things that we also do on the side. So here we are. Mr. Burgess, welcome to my virtual fireside chat. Why don't we start out? Tell me, remind me again, like we met 10 years ago, but what have you been doing in your life that makes you an entrepreneur? Give us the quick version, I guess. Otherwise, we'll do the whole hour.
So way back when I was like, it actually started when I was probably when I was in high school that I started being an entrepreneur. My mate Brent, I can't remember his last name. Anyway, Brent's dad owned the local deli, or the local bodega, I guess you would say in America. And you couldn't sell out of code chocolate, like anything that had gone out of date. And so he and I used to take all of the out of date chocolates and sell them at school. Except that I grew up in Western Australia, so like in the summer it was 45, whatever that is in Fahrenheit. I don't know.
Oh, that's like 120 degrees Fahrenheit or something absurd.
I do temperature by logic, so it would get really hot and all the chocolates would melt. So I spiked power and installed a bar fridge in an abandoned locker so that we were able to sell cold chocolates. So that's kind of where my entrepreneurial bent started, mostly just because I wanted money to spend. But then fast forward, I started writing freelance copy when I was still in high school. And then I was studying, I was in pre-law, and I decided that I did not want to be stuck in university. Growing up in the 70s, Perth did not have a lot of options when it came to to college classes and things that I was interested in. I mean, with my talents and interests, it was either become a journalist or become a lawyer. Like that was kind of what my options were. So I was in pre-law, and then I had this realization that I was going to be stuck in a box for the rest of my life. So I quit university. I went walkabout for 4 years around Australia, and eventually just started working for myself. So I've been really like running my own businesses since I was 14, but really like my entire adult life, I've been working in the impact sector as an entrepreneur as well as a management consultant at the same time.
Yeah, that's and that's kind of how we met, right? Somebody said at SOCAP, it's like literally 10 years ago. I think it's still one of the most useful things that's come out of SOCAP for me. It's like meeting you. And some of you may have read my very public breakup with that esteemed impact conference on LinkedIn, but we digress. But talk about that intersection of the businesses that you have created and impact.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that's always been really interesting to me is scale, right? And I don't think that scale is sort of like the thing that every impact organization should orient itself towards. It's just what was interesting to me. So I became interested very early in the application of technology. And when I met you, I was just off the back of having had a startup in Boulder, Colorado. I'd moved to San Francisco, and I've been talking to, it's hard to believe that it was 10 years ago because the same conversations I'm having today. A bunch of tech entrepreneurs who'd built something that had created some value. They'd run out of time, they'd run out of money, they'd run out of inspiration, they'd run out of breath, something I rarely do. And they were looking for a way out and were finding it very hard to find a path out. And so I was, because I'd been in all these conversations, I was at SOCAP to raise a roll-up fund. The plan was to basically launch an M&A fund and acquire all of these distressed technical assets, make those entrepreneurs whole in some way, and then build the one platform to rule them all. And that's where you and I met. We had this like great philosophical conversation where we agreed on everything except that. You're like, that's never going to work. And it's like, well, that's interesting. And and then sort of just kind of kept going from there.
Oh, you buried the lead. You came around to my view of.
That's true. I did come around to your view. Yes, it happens.
And so we're actually, so for those of you who just wanted in, we're actually building a sort of a tech for good platform together, and that's a topic for another day. But it is very much conceived of with Cameron's design genius, I might add, as a collectively held and governed platform of platforms, if you will, right? So when we think about the tech that the space needs, right, we think of it in terms of a sort of a Mondragon for impact technology, like to use this famous Spanish cooperative, even though we're currently incorporated as a Delaware C Corp, but you can operate any company with co-op principles. Like it doesn't have to be incorporated as a co-op. And to transition us to our topic today, governance, we run shockingly efficient governance, not just because the founders of the company are all INTJs on the Myers-Briggs.
That helps.
That helps, however, but that's not actually the takeaway for this call, to say just find people who are exactly like you and then governance is easy. But we've actually spent a lot of thought and energy designing the governance model for our company, even when it was very small and it was literally just 2 or 3 of us sort of in the day-to-day. And I think that's one of the places where I want to start to sort of unpack governance for Grownups, because I think that's where a lot of founders make their first mistake. Impact founders, right? Like we're creating something, you've already come around to the view of like, I want to make money and change the world for the better. I'm going to create a company, maybe with some friends, some mates, you know, like your chocolate example, somebody who sees the world the way you do. And then we're off to the races. We go charging over the horizon, building the thing, and without stopping to think about what are the rules of engagement here amongst ourselves, right? And that's where we see things go horribly wrong down the line. And so I'm curious about some of the some of the train wrecks that you have seen or participated in, as the case
One of
may
the trains that I've driven off the cliff.
be. Yeah, this is in fact the governance encounter group for those of you just joining us. And if you've joined us, I'll just say one more time, so you can interact with us, preferably by emoji. Thank you, Sam, for laughing at our jokes. And there's also a Q&A box that should either be up on your screen or accessible through a little purple question mark at the top, or under the 9 stacked dots on the lower right. Anyway, train wrecks, go.
Yeah, train wrecks. So what I was going to say was that God, I could talk about this forever. Like, one of the challenges is that people who come into this sector and want to do meaningful work, make the world a better place, is that they're generally really frustrated by limitations, right? Like constraints that we don't think should exist in the world, whether it's lack of access to funding or, clean air, clean water, democracy, right? Like whatever it is that you are sort of railing against. And so, like, our part of the way in which we are entrepreneurs is that we're constantly looking to open the aperture, right? Like expand choice, because if you're expanding choice, you have more freedom. But you don't build a successful commercial enterprise or any enterprise by consistently expanding choice. Like, you can't sell if you can't constrain choice. And so decide literally means kill choice. And so this is one of the things that I'm often bringing to the organizations that I'm working with. So when it comes to governance, like, there are a lot of philosophical ideas about the ways in which an impact organization should function, because we look at things like hierarchy and we say, well, that's not particularly involved in having a boss who tells you what to do, and it's not recognizing your sovereignty and agency, despite the fact that 90% of the people who work just really want to be told what to do. And so we try to create these more evolved governance structures that map to how we think the world should operate. But it's not the way that a business will successfully operate, or it's not the way that an organization will successfully operate all of the time. And so one of the things that I've often said in keynotes and in workshops is, like, the only reason that I'm here is because you in the audience haven't availed yourself of the tens of thousands of books that have already been written and the YouTube videos that have already been recorded on best practice. And like, you keep on thinking that, well, you have the better idea on how to run an organization than people who've been doing this for decades. And it's not to say that we can't and shouldn't evolve, but there are some reasonable principles that we need to stick to. So coming back to the very sort of beginning of, like, starting an organization, something that I've seen, which I think is like the singular most significant mistake that impact founders make, is that they assume equality in all things. And that is a terrible assumption. So part of what I developed was a framework, because I was working, I've done a lot of work in crisis management with impact organizations, was creating a framework to help founders and co-founders, like, navigate some of the difficult conversations that they probably should have had earlier on, and to expose and unpack some of the assumptions that they've made that led to them running the organization and sort of setting up governance the way that they had. And it's just 4 really simple questions. So the first was like, and done in isolation, right? So I don't believe in, my brand name is Uncompromise. I don't believe in compromise. I don't believe in negotiation. Like, to me, negotiation is about, like, what is the sort of minimum viable level of disagreement and dissatisfaction that you can achieve. That's what negotiation leads to. Like, I'll let go of something I really want if you let go of something that you really want. And to me, it's a very different conversation when you show up and you're very clear about what you want. And that does, because then you can start to have an informed conversation rather than getting dragged off track by the more charismatic, convincing person, right? Which is often what happens. The extroverts wind up ruling the world even though they shouldn't. And so the first question is around contribution. What am I willing to give to this? Is it time? Is it money? Is it resources? Is it an office space? Is it a basement? Doesn't matter what it is, but what am I willing to contribute? And then compensation, what do I want to get? It doesn't have to be financial, it can be non-financial. It could be, I want to be on the front cover of Time magazine, or I want to be able to knock off work at 3 o'clock every day so I can pick up my kids from school. Again, that doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that you document it. So contribution, compensation, culture is the other thing, right? Again, like, how do I want to feel working on this? What is the experience that I want to have? And then control. So contribution, compensation, culture, and control. And control is, how do I ensure that these three things are true? And that can be by being the CEO, it could be by being a majority shareholder, it could be, there's a variety of control mechanisms that exist. But what typically happens is someone goes, well, we want to do whatever it is that we want to do, so we're going to start an organization, usually deciding what legal form it should be before they've even figured out the strategy, which is another enormous mistake. And then just say, well, we're all just going to do it together, right? And maybe if you're in your 20s, like, this is a very common thing to do. But by the time you get to our age and you've got mortgages and kids and trying to put kids through college and like all of the other obligations that come with, frankly, being an adult in the world, like, you don't have the freedom to just kind of go, well, I'm going to live on ramen and sleep on a bare concrete floor for the next 6 months, and we'll figure it out later. Because the truth is that figuring it out later is when everything breaks.
You know, apropos, I'm not at all triggered by you mentioning the 20-year-olds. Not apologies or not to any 20-year-olds in the room, but I was actually being lectured at South by Southwest a few months ago by a woman in her 20s about how her generation is taking the 7th-generation approach to systems change. And I'm like, as somebody who's worked on it for close to 2 generations now, I think I know what you're talking about. And also, you will discover that everybody martyr themselves and everything be done by consensus. It's just not practicable. Right? I mean, philosophically,
and
this is great.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing, because I'm writing a book at the moment, and this is one of the things that is like a core theme in the book, is around like how people who build impact organizations have unwittingly embodied this spirit of self-sacrifice to the point that they have martyred themselves on the cross of their own mission. And they don't mean to. It's not like they're trying to be martyrs or they believe that they're saints. It's just that, like, somehow we've gone, well, my suffering doesn't matter, right? Like, I have to, you know, I am the poster child of privilege, which is something that I'm always saying because I'm a straight white middle-aged guy. But like, we have this belief that, like, well, our suffering doesn't matter, or the sacrifice matters more, right? And I think that, again, when you're younger, these are bets that are easier to make. You've got more life in front of you. You've got less to lose. But you get to our age and you kind of have a lot to lose, right?
The thing that surprises me in working with people of all ages is how ill-prepared most of us are to have these robust conversations about governance, right? And the 4C framework that you just outlined, or even I remember in an earlier iteration of our company, when we were incorporated as an LLC partnership, our lawyers put in front of us this wonderful worksheet that basically it was like a prenup, right? Like it was down to like,
how are you going to break up?
How are you going to break up? And I think one of the options that I remember vividly was the Texas shootout.
That's right. Yeah.
About how you had to handle basically offers of a hostile buying you out, like, or whatever it was, and it was, but it went into a lot of detail, like what happens if you're dismembered and can no longer work, or what happens with your heirs, like how do you want your spouse or children to show up in this company? And I felt like a little bit of like what's that about, you know? And yet it is exactly the right thing to do on the outset of a venture together, to sort of outline essentially the ways by which A, you break up, and B, or potentially break up, what are the mechanisms, and B, how do the founders get out? And that's something that applies from a governance perspective. And you and I were just talking about this before we all came on. How many times have we seen a nonprofit organization where the founder is just not leaving in time, and there is no mechanism that has ever been contemplated by the board at inception or whenever to engineer that transition? And so that's a common problem in the social impact space, is founders who just hang on too long. And there's no, again, it's simple to do at the inception when nobody's thinking about leaving, to actually write it into your bylaws, right? That there is maybe a review process, or in X years time, we'll revisit the founder question. I co-founded one organization where the founders had a special share class that we programmed to sunset, right? So there's any number of ways you can contemplate your own demise as a founder, your own exit, right? And maintain control over some period of time and then say, okay, by year 5 or by the moment we hit X amount in revenue or Y amount of impact, we actually contemplate moving on. And, I think don't also, see that enough.
Like people who are entrepreneurs have an inbuilt belief in their own inviolability, and you kind of have to have that to be an entrepreneur. Like, doesn't mean that you have to be arrogant, but you do have to have a sense that you know what you're doing. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother going and doing it. But the challenge that I've discovered, and from my own experience as well as from working with others, is that when you're not clear about what you want to get out of what it is that you're doing, you often wind up hanging around because you didn't get what you wanted because you were never clear about it. And you believe that the only way that you're going to get what you want is if you continue to be in charge. But the truth is that, like, governance and management are skills, and they either get stronger or they get weaker. And as an organization grows and changes, like, you might be great at being, like a mum or a dad, right? Like dealing with a small group of people. But there are sort of well-proven dynamics of what happens as organizations change in size, where it goes from like, well, you know everybody by name, and then one day you show up to the office and there's a bunch of people you don't even know who they are. And so you may not have the skills or the appetite or the experience to run a $20 million organization that started as a $1 million organization, right? But there is this kind of sense of, like failing up, right? Or the Peter principle, like everybody operates at their highest level of incompetence. So like, just because you started a thing doesn't mean that you necessarily have the skills to keep running the thing once it hits a certain scale. And it's good to know that coming in, right? Because then it's much easier to say, well, I can recognize that this organization is coming to a point where we're going to need to hire somebody other than me, and to have a mechanism that helps, as you said, right, that's already engineered in, that allows for those reviews and for those conversations, so that what you don't wind up having happen, which so often happens, is the board kicking out the founder. Because ultimately the board is not responsible to the founder, the board is responsible to the organization. And so, like, if the founder's not doing a good job running the organization, the board's going to fire them. They have a responsibility to. And nobody wants to do that. That's a horrible thing to have to do.
It's actually, it occurs to me that in like venture-funded companies that are just doing their blitz scaling, they're, charging ahead, becoming a unicorn or whatever, there's actually, it's not kind or humane, right? But there is sort of much more rigor around, oh, by the time you're coming to your C round or whatever you're raising, chances are the founder team needs replacing because now you're in a sort of an accepted growth trajectory. Of course, everything is hockey sticking for the VC funded companies. But there is the sense like, oh, you get to a certain level, chances are the founders will not have grown with the company, and then the investors push them out because, of course, investors are going to do what VCs do. But it occurs to me, certainly between our experience, right, we could almost map out sort of a founder journey, not along some weird, unicorn blitz scaling trajectory, but around like an impact scaling trajectory, where we might say you either have to continually keep educating yourself, or it may be time to move on. And I wonder what those gates would look like. I just know that, so I don't want to, we don't need to go like that's a solution for another day, perhaps. But what I don't see enough of is investment in board development and governance evolution in impact organizations.
Well, and I think that evolution is a critical term when it comes to governance, right? Because like something that, when it's my company, it's an autocracy. I'm in charge, right? Like there is no other law but mine. If it's just me, or if it's I am the founder and I've got a bunch of employees, there's nothing wrong with autocracy. It's just a form of governance. It's kind of like it moves from autocracy to something like aristocracy, right? Where you've got a small number of people who are in charge, and then it becomes bureaucracy and there's a bunch of middle management, and then it kind of moves to democracy and then holocracy and sociocracy. They're all kind of different forms of governance, and they're appropriate at different evolutionary stages of an organization, but they're also appropriate for different evolutionary stages of teams. So like, just because you're a bunch of highly experienced, well-informed, flat structured, circle driven people, right, who've like been through all of the different types of organizations, and you're starting a new organization, doesn't mean that like your team who you are hiring are going to understand what it means to function in a sociocracy.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this expectation that kind of gets foisted on people about like, well, you have to operate in a more evolved environment because this is the right way to do things. And then people are just lost because there's an absence of direction. And then maybe a successful organization, which has been running according to sociocratic principles, now winds up in crisis.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like I've been there.
Yeah.
That sounds a little too familiar.
Well, and what is the thing about like in Rome, right? Like they used to have this thing in, you know, like they would sort of appoint someone to be the guardian of the city in you know, when it was being sacked. And then at the end of that, you know, when that campaign was over, well, it would go back to being a democracy again. Like, so you've got to be able to, look, governance has to be able to breathe and be responsive to the moment that the organization is in.
Yeah, that's a really good takeaway, right? Like you have to, again, like be ready for crisis, whether that's externally generated or internally, as in the case of the sociocratically governed organization that I co-founded, where to your point, you know, both the team and the boards of directors were really not prepared for the job. And that was a bitter lesson, right? Like you think you're aligned on principle, you think you're aligned on the outcomes and impact you're trying to achieve in the world. And then you discover, the way I would summarize this is, you know, then you discover that people have these internalized narratives, largely inherited by 20th century sort of Fordist management principles that are really hard to overcome when you're, especially when you're in startup mode and you need to move fast, or at least somewhat expeditiously, right? And that's where things can really go off the rails, and did for us. And it was pretty hard to then rein that back in, and have people who knew enough about governance to do the really brutal work of then basically having to fire boards of directors and staff.
Right.
I mean, that's nobody's idea of fun. And it's, when I look at some of these governance crises that I've been part of, I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, but part of me wants to be much more rigorous about asking people about what they know about these specific forms of governance, right? Because, I mean, I ran into some shocking levels of ignorance. Like I had a board chair once who thought that she didn't have to consult with the rest of the board of directors to take action on behalf of the organization.
Wow.
I'm like, that's elementary, right? And it was a very senior person in the field that we sort of co-inhabited, and it was just like, wow. I mean, if you have a first-time executive director who overreaches and says, well, I'm out of options, I'm going to suggest we burn down or shut down the organization, you can sort of say, chalk that up to inexperience or whatever, right? But to have a boomer, basically, you know, not to disparage generations, but to have somebody who has been in the nonprofit industrial sector for a long time, philanthropic industrial sector for a very long time, and has served on multiple boards, to have this sort of very basic failure of understanding of what the board role is. That was I was surprised. And so part of what I'm trying to get at is like, how do you avoid bad surprises, especially when things go off the rails?
How do you avoid bad surprises? God, wouldn't that be put that in a jar and be a billionaire? I mean, I think that like part of it is like recognizing that people are people and we're all traumatized, right? And so, and part of the challenge is that like you don't actually really know what someone's trauma is, even if they know it, which usually we don't. And so I think that like part of this thing about like trying to build businesses that are better for the world is building businesses that are better for people. And it does mean that there is, you know, as some people say, like there's an increased responsibility for good quality peopling in organizations of this nature, which is often sort of like and I think that if founders aren't doing that or leaders aren't doing that, then they're missing something important, particularly in cross-generational things and cross-cultural things, right? Like you and I are of a similar generation, and we see the world in similar ways because we grew up, basically in the same year. And you grew up in Germany, I grew up in Australia. We're both pretty no bullshit cultures, and so like we have similar ways of looking at the world. They're not always the same. Like sometimes yours and my ways of looking at the world diverge quite radically. But then you look at generational differences, and generations view the world differently because they grew up with different social norms or more emotional intelligence or more understandings of trauma, which was like, I was saying to somebody recently, in my world, you were sane or you were crazy. There was no like gray in between space. And so like that's, but there's also a responsibility to I don't think to like constantly accommodate that either, right? Like it's still a job. You still got a job to do. You still have responsibilities. There's still a function within an organization, and like these are things that things that need to get done on time, on spec, on budget. But there is I feel like a need to be just more in tune, or taking the time to check in with how people are doing, because as particularly as things get worse, I know that my tendency is to become just increasingly brutal and didactic, right? Like decide there's a thing that needs to be done, we need to do it, because that's my mode of dealing with a crisis, and in some contexts that works really well, but it doesn't work for everyone, and particularly when you're a leader of an organization.
Right.
But I think that, like, to your point, contemplating, right? Like contemplating that it's a statistical probability that shit's going to go off the rails, and therefore you should make sure that you've thought about the ripcords that you can pull in advance, so that when it does happen, you can think about that. The one final thing, I know I'm ranting, but the one final thing I wanted to point to in something that you said was, and something that I've observed in a range of organizations, is when you don't transition founders well, right? Like, and because not every founder wants to stick around forever. A lot of them are very happy to move on. But if you don't transition them well, then you wind up with shadow governance, and shadow governance is a disaster.
That's deadly, yeah.
Because you can't really hold somebody accountable to doing a thing that they're not being paid to do, and they're doing it because they think they're doing it in the best interest of the organization. Plus, they have all the gravitational pull of being a founder, so people listen to them. And that kind of, and I've observed that across a lot of organizations that I've worked with, and it often comes down to that the founders think their vision is being perverted, or they don't agree with something, or they're having a hard time letting go, or whatever it might be. And again, like, that's where the peopling really matters, because if you started a thing, you started it because you care about the outcome. And in some cases, people are, quite happy to just walk away. But in many cases, people kind of hover around, right? Because they want to make sure that their baby is okay. And that's understandable.
It's totally understandable. And I have a personal story about that. But before I share that, I just posted in the Q&A a bunch of questions that people had sent in with their registrations. I'm all the anonymous questions. If you could all take a minute to just vote and upvote, like, where you want us to go next, that'd be appreciated. Otherwise, I'll just be all autocratic and German and just choose my favorite questions to answer. So go do that if you don't mind. But on that founder transition, right? So I left an I was the president and CEO of a good-sized hybrid organization, 12 or so years ago, and left there as president and CEO because the founder ultimately wasn't ready to really move on yet. And that was fine. I knew that going in, that there was a 50% chance of failure, because that's what founder transitions have, a 50% failure chance. And so I was okay with that. But now here it is 12 years later, and he's still hovering around. They just lost their most recent incarnation of the post-founder ED, and are in crisis once again, because, like, and he's in the board chair's ear saying, like, here's the person you should hire. It's like, what the hell, right? Like 12 years later. And that is what governance failure looks like, right?
Yeah.
Like, here's a board that hasn't drawn rigorous lines around the container of the organization, And I think that's actually a good setup for talking about some of the things we can do to avoid these sorts of issues early on, right? Like there's a question about what alternatives to current boards of directors structures are more inclusive and suitable for mission-driven orgs, whether for-profit or non. And I don't know that there's an easy answer to that one, right? Because you're still in today's economy, right? We're still in the here and now and the current laws and regulatory regime. So everybody running off to create, distributed autonomous organizations is not the answer. Although good luck with that, because they have their own issues. And so this dance between compliance, right? Like you have to have a certain makeup, like in most states. In the US, you have a minimum requirement of 2 board members, right? I mean, there are just certain legal requirements that you have to fulfill. But then inside of that, I think one of the things that I have seen is people doing a public recruitment process for board members and being very transparent about who they're looking for. And it sort of goes hand in hand. One, it's very transparent, which frequently sort of aligns with values that organizations have in the social impact space. And secondly, it allows you and actually forces you to think about sort of what's the job description for your board, right? Like a founding board has very different needs of its board members than a more mature organization. And I think being really clear about what are the job descriptions we need now, so that you can, for example, do a public recruitment process and or can actually audit yourself, right, is incredibly important, right? And then that allows you to say, for example, as a value, right, we might say, well, we want to be representative of the communities we serve. Great, then make that part of your job description for your board makeup. Right. So you have representation from the community, for example.
Yeah, I mean, inclusive is like one of those words that's kind of, for me, it's difficult to know precisely what it means. But like I'm dealing with an organization right now that, raised $300 million and, got very busy, produced a lot of value, had a team that was being compensated, but the team was always subject to decisions that were being made opaquely by the management team. And that was having an impact upon them. So I think that this is where structure and governance sort of merge a little bit, is that like the first thing is like make your team shareholders, like figure out how to make that real, because then they are lots to, like they help create the mission log. They have the right to a voice in governance, and give your team a governance representative on the board. Like to me, that's a critical thing to do. Because if you're looking for continuity, you don't want to have people disappearing on you, right? Like, I mean, obviously, sometimes people have to get fired and organizations restructure around of money or whatever it might be. But I think that like there is a tendency, particularly early on, to not think about how to bring team members deeper in. Yeah. It doesn't mean that they're not going to leave, right? But give them a voice, because their lives are impacted by the decisions that the organization makes. And it just seems appropriate to me that they should have the opportunity to participate in governance. And it might be tokenistic, right? Like that could be a criticism that's leveled against it. But you need a mechanism for team members to have a voice in governance, even if ultimately they don't have enough voting rights or whatever it is to really sway big decisions. But the mechanism, I think, needs to exist, because then your team feels involved and they feel heard, and that's really important.
Yeah, so job descriptions for board members and participation by team members, preferably as shareholders. It actually goes well with one of the next questions here about, how do you scale purpose-driven ventures and maintain governance control to a healthy degree with your insiders, i.e. founders, workers, your shareholders, while also balancing that power with power and oversight for also essential outsider stakeholders. And that's where I find it, I think the question, it was too long to just paste it into the thing, but I think started out with an observation about the co-op sector in particular. And I find whether or not you're incorporated as structured as a co-op, nothing prevents you from adopting sort of cooperative operating principles.
Right.
And recognizing essentially a form of patronage and tying that to governance rights. And we did this in an earlier version of our business together when we were organized as a partnership. So think law firm, right? Where you can have senior partners and junior partners, and you have a very clear pathway for how somebody transitions from associate to junior partner to senior partner. And in law firms, it's a combination of bringing in billable hours and just seniority by time, right? And you can buy your way into the next higher group if you just show up with cash. Not that that's the right answer for every business, right? But there is so for example, we did this through deferred compensation. So we could make partners that we were working with actual partners in the legal sense in our business if they forewent compensation, and that put them into a different ownership and also governance bracket.
Yeah.
So that's a principle I really like, sort of tying this inside outside to essentially a form of patronage, right? So you can have your insiders, your workers are literally contributing to the value creation, and you can even give them a different share class, whether that's in a co-op or in a C corp. You can give them different voting rights as part of that share class, right? And so that's another thing we did in a number of organizations that I have co-founded, is just give different share classes different governance rights and voting rights. And then decisions, for example, in that model, that if you are a worker in the business and the annual plan and budget very directly affects what you do, right? Then maybe that is a decision that you have some voting rights over. Right. Whereas the decision whether or not to expand the business to another country, you might say, well, that's really something for the investor shareholders, or maybe it's for our external partners, but it doesn't need to involve the people who are in the day-to-day.
Well, and that comes back to like challenges with philosophy versus practicality, right? Because often it's like, well, everybody's voice is equal. And it's like, no, it's absolutely not. That's a fallacy that everybody's voice is equal. I'm working with a team of engineers right now. I know what it is that I want those engineers to achieve. I don't know how to achieve it. So for me to have a voice in how engineering decisions are made is purposeless. I need to provide the engineers with like what it is that we're trying to achieve and by when, so that they can come back and tell me, well, this is the approach that we would take, and here's the rationale. And so, yeah, like not every voice is equal in every context. And that's, I also think, is something that's really important to figure out very early on. I remember consulting with a guy in Australia, it was probably a decade or so ago, and he had built, it was a private equity real estate company. And I'm not going to mention the brand because it's a global brand, but it had been, he basically he'd come from merchant banking. He was very community oriented. He had borrowed a bunch of money. He'd mortgaged his house to buy this property in the center of Melbourne to run a hub for entrepreneurs. And he had created this sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem in a very inclusive way, in a very participatory way. But the community was off the rails in terms of like their expectations around what say they had in what was getting done. And I was called in to facilitate an intervention with the community. And I just said to them straight up, it's like, his neck is the one that's on the block, not yours. Like, thing falls over, you're just going to go find another co-working space. You don't care. So, like, your expectations are completely out of sync with your risk. Like, you have zero risk and he has 100% of the risk, but you want to be able to drive all of these decisions about pricing and participatory governance and all of these other things. But if this business fails, this guy's going to lose his home. And that matters. And like you and I have experienced that within our own organization, not internal tussles, but tussles that we've had with external stakeholders who are going, well, how can I trust you, to provide, a technology platform for us if you're a for-profit business? I'm like, how can you not? Like, we don't deliver a valuable service. Right. But if we're constantly grant funded, as long as we can find the next grant to keep us going, we never really have to deliver like a truly viable product people are going to make use of. That was a complete side tangent, Like,
it turns out to be a good transition to this next question, actually. You see
Okay.
somebody thinking through the business model for their social enterprise, but it's being perceived as ultimately for profit. So
yeah.
how do we systematically ensure that a for-profit and for-purpose business doesn't just end up a for-profit first? And boy, is that a loaded question.
And I would say, and why is that a concern?
Why is that a concern? Well, I think the concern is probably around, I would call it mission drift, right? Like, how do you anchor the purpose side when you're also in the business of making money? And we achieve that in our business together through basically a founder share class.
Yep.
Right? We achieve it through only taking on investors to date who are investing on terms that actually don't give them any governance rights.
Yep.
Right? So you're basically, I mean, it comes down to a choice of investor and whose money you take. Right? There are some investors, including, I mean, there's some philanthropic investors, like our friends at the DRK Foundation, who practice venture philanthropy. Right. And for $300,000, they expect a board seat, which is sort of unheard of in grant funding circles, right? But that is roughly how a venture capital firm would also show up, right? They show up with a check, they expect to sit on your board, and they expect pretty hard governance rights, right? And so I think that's, but there are mechanisms for anchoring the purpose, right? So another device that is very powerful is essentially creating, well, a perpetual purpose trust is those have become popular in recent years, where the trust is acting on behalf of the social or environmental interest or the mission, and has some key shares and some maybe veto rights on those shares or what have you. Or what we've done in a co-op that I co-founded is a golden share that can be held by a purpose trust or a mission-driven organization, including a nonprofit, and that can have very limited rights and very limited circumstances, right? So in the case of the co-op, the golden share only has a veto right, in fact, when it comes to demutualization, right? So so that you can create some very powerful governance mechanisms that are surgical. They're not broad.
Yeah.
And only sort of bite, right, in a moment of a major decision.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was reacting a little bit to the question just in terms of, like, because your answer is more structural, and mine is more psycho-emotional, which is that like, if you look at, to me, like, there is this misconception around doing good work in the world, which is that, okay, so we know that capitalism is broken, and that it's not serving everybody well. However, without capitalism, there would be no philanthropy. Without philanthropy, there would be no grant making. And so to me, like, if you actually want to run an ethical organization, and I think that in some cases, certainly there are plenty of instances where making a profit on delivering essential services would just be a gross thing to do. But if you want to be able to make your own bets and pursue your own mission, then you have to be for profit first, right? That doesn't mean allowing your mission to drift. Like, as you've said, there are all sorts of mechanisms that you can put in place to ensure that mission drift doesn't take place. But also, like, if you are delivering something that people want, they will pay you for it. If you are running a business, then you must make profit, otherwise you can't grow. And you probably can't, at the very least, can't repay yourself for all of the time, effort, and energy that you've put in. And that's part of the reason why Ashford and my company is a for-profit venture, because between us, the founders have put in well over $1 million each in blood, sweat, and tears in order to get this thing off the ground. So we have a reasonable expectation of a return, and we will never get that return unless we sell or we generate profit.
Yeah, I actually want to unpack that a bit more, right? Because a lot of times people say, oh, for-profit is sort of the antithesis to purpose. I'm just like, it's not, because the way you articulate it is, profit means you have extra that you can invest back into your business, right? And if you're a founder and actually, like, back to wanting to buy a house or send your kids to school, whatever, that profit goes into your pocket where it can do good work, right? I think a lot of times what people say when they say for profit means that sort of rapacious, Silicon Valley style of creating a venture funded startup. Notice, however, that a lot of those companies are actually not managed for profit.
No.
Like, in fact, they burn a whole bunch of venture capital.
Yeah.
And if they're profitable by the time they get to IPO, that's counted as success, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of these companies, like the Ubers and the Metas and the whatnots, actually get to profitability after having invested billions of dollars of venture capital. And so I actually think that managing for profit your venture, including a nonprofit. This is one of my favorite misconceptions about nonprofits, is that you can't make a profit. No, absolutely, you can absolutely make a profit in a nonprofit company or organization. It's called net assets.
Yeah,
you just can't distribute it because you have no investors, you have no shareholders.
Yeah.
But that idea that you are managing towards a bottom line that returns extra at the end of the year, in my mind, that's just good business sense. And having a board or having a governance regime that encourages that is, I think, what all of us should be wanting, right? Like whether you're for-profit or non-profit, the idea that there's extra at the end of the fiscal year that you can distribute to shareholders and stakeholders and or reinvest, that to me is just good business. And so,
well, because all external funds come with strings.
100%.
It doesn't matter. Like, they might be strings that you're comfortable being tied to, but like it still comes with strings. All external capital has an expectation. So being able to make your own bets and chart your own course requires you to have profit. It's the only way. It also makes the only way that you can navigate changes in the economy and survive things like COVID or supply chain disruptions, right? You can get insurances for some of these things for sure, but there's a lot that you simply can't insure against.
Yeah, so I think, to the person who asked that question, when you think about your business model, it's really being clear with the people that you allow onto your cap table, right? And again, it doesn't matter if that's a for-profit or a non-profit. Like your grant makers are essentially on your cap table too. And some of those strings are the worst. Like I've turned down money from grant makers who wanted to only give us money for brand new programs and no existing staff.
That's one of them. I mean, in our experience with the company that we acquired out from underneath its nonprofit overlords, all that we wanted was a line of credit, and they wouldn't give us one. So we had to go through an acquisition process to actually get control of the company, and that was costly. So I think those are the kinds of things you want to think about early. Including, whose money you take on what terms, because a lot of outside money has those strings, and a lot of them come in the form of governance rights, right? And so that's where you can both be proactively and sort of preemptively, structure things in ways that preserve your mission through clever governance devices, and frankly, just be careful whose money you take. I think there's at least one more question here on. And we're covering a lot of ground, as I knew we would. What does it look like on paper to design a governance model that is breathable? How much of it needs to be sorted out at the beginning? That's a good one. It is a good question.
Well, my quick answer to that one is, like when we have worked together, you have this great 10-step framework that you use to work with impact enterprises of all different sizes, and governance is an explicit sort of design element. And when you think about it in the nonprofit world or in the impact world in general, right? Like we frequently do sort of a review of values and purpose and culture, right? Which often get expressed in terms of mission and vision statements. We annually review strategy because that's tied to OKRs and outcomes and whatnot. We continually look at our like communications and raising capital and how we're going to scale, but there's a sort of a blind spot in re-examining if the structure is still fit for purpose, and re-examining
if the governance structure is working.
And if the governance structure is working. And so my short answer to this question is, I would roll that into a periodic review process. And I'm just sitting with annual is probably too much, but every few years, is it every 2 or 3 years? Or as you get to certainly anytime you take in new investors, I would interrogate the governance mechanism and the legal structure.
Yeah, I mean, my response to that is to say that, like, take those 4 questions that I started with around contribution, compensation, culture, control, because that's very telling, and helps to surface potential tensions at the beginning. Second thing is trust doesn't scale. So, like, it's really important to work with people that you trust. But what's the old saying about, like, trust in Allah and tie up your camel? Like, trust matters, but documentation matters just as much. Astrid and I trust each other a lot. We've worked together for a very long time. And we still have very clear written agreements that we have periodically reviewed, and we've been through a number of different organizational changes over the last decade. And they haven't always been easy, but part of what has made it easier has been the fact that we've taken the time to write things down and to think about it, and to take the time, as Astrid said, to review periodically. And I think that, like, every 2 years at a minimum really matters. I think the other thing is to say that, like, make sure that you have adults on your board. And by that, I mean people who know what it means to be on a board. Too often, early stage founders seek their board with people that they know and that they trust. And as I said, trust doesn't scale. So you also need a certain set of skills on a board, which comes back to what is the job description, right? Like, are you working in a highly regulated industry, and you need somebody who has that kind of compliance brain and experience to be able to help you navigate that? That's a really helpful person to have on your board. Maybe you don't need that person. Maybe you need somebody else. But, like, I also remind people when I've been doing interventions with boards specifically, is that being a board member it's a privilege and an obligation. It's not a right. And if you have somebody who is, like, treating a board position as something that they're entitled to, don't put them on the board. And if you think that, you know, you're dealing with somebody who believes that, like, being on the board infers a lot of rights for them, well, no, they're actually there to safeguard the purpose of the organization. That's their job. And I think that, like, getting clear about the attributes of what makes for a good board matters. Obvious things like never have an even number of people on a board, because you can never unblock a disagreement if it happens. And I do think that, like, really thinking through in advance and documenting what are our agreed upon mechanisms for dealing with conflict, because conflict is going to arise. It's inevitable, but people have conflict.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, one of the hardest or harder lessons I learned is, you know, that you can do a lot of good work sort of preparing yourself mentally and on paper for changes that the organization will come through, will go through and evolve. What sometimes people overlook, and yours truly included, is, you know, what happens when the call comes from inside the house? Right? Like, do you actually have a mechanism? And it's remarkable how often this happens in the nonprofit world, right? In fact, like, if you think back to OpenAI, right, when they had the board firing Sam Altman and he gets back reinstated, I mean, that's shoddy governance design that could happen in both directions, right? And so there are some pretty charismatic examples of how not to do it. But having a mechanism whereby the board essentially audits itself and has a way to sort of take action when board members don't perform or underperform is incredibly important. And I hardly ever see that in any of the organizations I deal with. I have an initiative I'm advising now on their spin out from 2 nonprofits, neither of which have never started a commercial venture. I'm like, oh boy, this is really not a commercialization project. This is a governance evolution in a hurry problem.
Right.
You know, and it's very different. So in an ideal world, they would have anticipated this and last year started evolving their board, right? And that's, of course, not what happened. And so that breathability thing is like, can you, to misquote Wayne Gretzky, right? Can you skate to where the puck is going? So I think you, as the CEO, you know, have an opportunity and responsibility to shape the board. And can you essentially bring on the capacity that you're going to need in 12 to 18 months time? Because that's sort of the name of the game. And that's what it looks like on paper to keep your governance model breathable is
Breathable, yeah.
to anticipate what's next, and move in those slower evolutionary paces of boards.
Yeah. Yeah, and don't be afraid to appoint interim board members either, right? Like,
yes,
it's perfectly okay to bring somebody on for 6 months to fill a gap.
Yeah.
You're better off having somebody there for 6 months if you've only got 2 people on your board and expanding to 3 than you are sticking with 2 people, because then you have potentially unresolvable conflict.
Right.
The other thing that I'd say is, like, don't conflate ownership and governance. That's a common mistake. Is like, well, and know what hat you're wearing when you're in one conversation, because Asher and I are shareholders, we're also board members, and I'm the CEO. And so, like, if I kept on showing up to a conversation with my board wearing my shareholder hat when they're trying to hold my toes to the fire as the CEO, that's really problematic, right? Like this kind of thing of like, oh, you don't get to talk to me like that because I'm an owner. It's just like, no, I do get to talk to you like that because you're the CEO and you're doing a shitty job. So like figuring out like the cadence of things, which again in early stage organizations is hard because you've usually got the founders who are shareholders, who are also the board members, who are also the operations team.
Right.
And you've got to know like when you're wearing what hat and what conversation you're in, and setting those structures up in advance. So you can say, oh, we're going to have a weekly operations meeting, or we're going to have a monthly board meeting, we're going to have an annual shareholders meeting, and like that's it. Like, and you get to apply as a shareholder is once a year. Otherwise, you don't really get to talk about anything unless there is something that has to rise to the level of the shareholders.
Which just makes me chuckle about some of the shareholders we inherited from the company we bought, who seem to be still expecting impact reports from us when they and not realize
a fraction of a percent of our company.
Like, also, that was your exit event, so there is no more reporting entity.
No.
And on that note, as we chuckle about our minority shareholders, I think we're at time. I know it's getting into your evening. Everybody stuck around for the full hour, so I imagine there'll be some follow-up for you, Cameron. As always, I'll post a little AI-generated summary on my Substack. I'll send out a note immediately to folks so they know how to get in touch with you. And I'll see you again in our next meeting. And thank you, everyone, for sticking around. The minute you and I sign off, Cameron, it'll all just go blank. If you want to hang out, oh, look at the applause. Love it. Thank you all. Because we're co-hosts, it'll actually stop when both of us leave. All right. See you around all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.